Hi everyone, and welcome to the fourth week of Crim 210, where we'll be discussing contemporary theories of crime and delinquency as they apply especially to youth offending. These are theories that you're going to hear a lot about, especially if you take Crim 310 or especially Crim 300. The reason why we care about theory is that it allows us to not just be wandering in the dark. It allows us to understand the mechanisms by which different risk factors might actually explain why offending happens, or why different protective factors help to understand why offending does not happen. So theory is what typically guides our research. We use theory to identify what we should measure, what we should then include in our statistical analyses. So I think it's very, very important. And I'll begin by describing a pretty classic economic theory of crime that was really rooted in that classical school that we described last week with Cesare Beccaria. There are two theories I'll talk about here. The first is Clark and Cornish and Clark and Felson's rational choice theory, which we talked about a little bit last week, just based on this idea that individuals will seek to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. We also introduced the concept of bounded rationality, this idea that maybe some individuals are less adept at making a rational choice in certain circumstances compared to others. Another theory is Cohen and Felson's routine activity theory. And this was based on the intersection of three factors: a motivated offender, a suitable target, and the absence of a capable guardian. These authors argued that crime would not occur if any one of these three factors were absent. So if we took away the suitable target, a crime would not occur. So if we remove the suitable target, if we were, for example, better able to lock cars or put those anti-lock steering devices across steering columns, then we would be able to prevent crime, because all we need to do is remove one of these three things from the equation, because it's their intersection that matters. And we saw this have a lot of influence in England, not just in terms of criminal behavior, but in terms of helping to prevent experiences of victimization as well. One of the things that occurred in England was they noticed an increase in suicide rates in this country. And one of the common modalities or ways in which individuals were committing self-harm was to stick their head inside of an oven and allow the gas in the oven to render them unconscious. So what England did was basically get rid of the gas-powered oven that would allow individuals the opportunity to commit suicide, and then that actually did result in a drop in the suicide rate. My kind of issue with routine activity theory is whether this approach actually reduces the underlying harm. So yes, you've taken away an opportunity to engage in suicide, but this theory tends to not focus on the individual, just like classical school. It wasn't coming up with individual explanations of offending or individualized treatment. It was just thinking about that proportionality of punishment, how to make sure that the pain outweighed the pleasure. Another technique, this is again is a theory that was quite popular in England, was the use of what's called a mosquito, and it's not the bug. If you live with parents or grandparents or anybody who's maybe like 40 years old, 50 years old, you might notice sometimes they will leave the black screen on the TV. So the TV is still on, but there's nothing actually showing on the TV other than the black screen and like a hum or a hiss that you can hear. Same thing with maybe a computer. The reason why people of a certain age will do this is not just because they don't understand technology, it's because as you age, your ability to detect certain frequencies or certain pitches becomes worse. The mosquito lets out this high-pitched. My dog definitely heard that. It's not a fun noise. And the idea is to place this mosquito box outside of like a 7-Eleven or a movie theater or places where youths might congregate, and then they emit this sound, and it keeps the youth from wanting to hang out and loiter around these buildings because of this really irritating pitch. But it won't drive away customers or desirables because they're old and they will actually be able to detect that pitch. So these are some of the ways that routine activity theory has worked. I can't say too much about youth offending because the routine activity theory perspective doesn't really care so much about the distinction between youth and adults. It's more about how do we prevent crime. What they might say is that, okay, for youth crime, we know, and I'll talk about this in a couple of weeks, that crime rates for youth tend to spike during unsupervised hours. For adults, we might see crime rates tend to be higher around like 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. when bars begin to let out, things like that. For youth, that 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. period is a particular vulnerable time because they are less likely to be monitored. They're out of school, but their parents aren't home from work. And so routine activities theory might argue, okay, we need to find a way to institute a capable guardian during this period of time. That way crime will no longer occur. Now on to some contemporary sociological theories of crime. And I'll begin with Travis Hershey's social bond theory that he developed in 1969, or that's when his book on social control emerged. And he essentially said that there were 4 things that had to happen, or that could happen, that would influence why somebody would not engage in crime. So this was a bit of a revolutionary perspective at the time, because Hershey was trying to explain why crime did not occur. And while it might have seemed revolutionary at the time, it was called revolutionary at the time, if we think back to Freud was actually talking about developmental stages or pathways that people had to go through to not engage in problematic behavior. He wasn't necessarily talking about crime, but Hershey's social bond theory is kind of in the same vein as Freud's earlier psychodynamic theory, except Hershey wasn't doing cocaine as far as I know. The reason why I'm pretty sure that Hershey was not doing cocaine is because Hershey was raised in Utah with a very large Mormon community. And one of the things that's well known about Mormon communities is low levels of antisocial and criminal behavior. So it really made sense that Hershey was taking his experiences in this community and trying to look at, like, why did I not engage in crime when I was a kid? Hershey thought about 4 ways that people bond: through attachment, commitment, involvement, and belief. So let's talk about what these 4 things mean. Attachment, according to Hershey, refers to having bonds to other people. Very importantly, it's not like social learning theory where bonds to delinquent individuals could increase risk of offending. Hershey actually didn't talk about whether the type of person that you were bonded to mattered. Instead, Hershey said that any attachment will do. So keep this in mind. In terms of the commitment aspect, what Hershey was referring to here was that individuals were wrapped up in different social activities. Maybe they were playing hockey after school, maybe they were in drama club, whatever they were doing, they had some social commitment, and they didn't want to engage in criminal behavior because it might jeopardize their ability to continue to participate in that social role as, hockey, football, whatever. Here's where students can sometimes get tripped up. Commitment and involvement sound very similar. Involvement is all about time. Involvement bond says that if an individual is wrapped up in social activities, they will simply lack the opportunity or the time to go out and engage in criminal behavior. They've got their early morning hockey practice, and then they have to go to school, and then they've got friends that they hang out with to do homework with, and then they're home for dinner, and then they're watching TV with their parents, where they're doing something where they're constantly engaged in activities that simply do not give them an opportunity to go out and engage in criminal behavior. The last bond is belief, which basically describes adherence to conventional social norms, the principles of religion, different social expectations. So similar to the conformist when we're talking about modes of adaptation described by Merton. What I want you to keep in mind, the reason why I told you the background of Hershey and his history living in communities that were traditionally comprised of a large proportion of Mormon persons, is that perhaps this might have given him a different perspective on what criminal behavior is like. That's maybe why he did not specify that attachment to others had to be pro-social rather than antisocial. He came from an area where there wasn't a lot of diversity. And so maybe he was not exposed to, for example, the youth that's growing up in a crime-ridden neighborhood that doesn't have a lot of social supports. Maybe the individuals that this person is attached to are involved in criminal behavior. Maybe within this subculture, the beliefs within their neighborhood are that crime is okay, that there are different techniques of neutralization that you can use to justify why it's okay to be involved in crime. Maybe the belief in this community is that you should be an innovator rather than a conformist. And so Hershey's theory was very, very valuable, but ultimately I think it neglected some pretty key aspects of life because he was looking where crime did not occur and not looking at where crime did occur. Hershey himself actually abandoned his social bond theory and in 1990, Godwinson and Hershey, so Michael Godwinson and Travis Hershey, developed what's called the general theory of crime. And this theory was like a rap diss track. It took aim at everybody. It was saying like, this theory is wrong, that theory is wrong, longitudinal research sucks, criminal career research sucks. Everybody is wrong, we're the only people that are right. Godwinson and Hershey's general theory of crime made one major assertion. They said that low self-control causes all crime all the time. That means low self-control causes property offending. Low self-control is the reason why the adolescent offends and why the adult offends. Low self-control causes violent offending, causes white-collar crime, causes drug trafficking. What is low self-control? There are a few different components to this construct. This includes things like being sensation-seeking, having a preference for immediate gratification, preferring short-term versus long-term goals, preferring to be physical rather than verbal in a person's communication, being very impulsive. These were all elements of low self-control. How does low self-control develop? Or three things have to happen so that low self-control does not develop. Before the age of about 8 to 10, according to Godwinson and Hershey, different parenting approaches have to occur. First things first, parents have to be able to be around to monitor their child. They have to be present. Second, they have to be able to recognize when their child is engaging in antisocial behavior or inappropriate behavior. Third, the parent needs to be able to appropriately respond to that child's behavior. So if little Johnny is hitting his sister over the head with a dump truck, the parent has to be there to see it. The parent has to recognize that this is not okay behavior and has to respond to Johnny in a way that's going to help Johnny learn that that behavior is wrong and to not do it again. So the parent can't simply smack Johnny over the head to teach him a lesson. The parent has to use one of those like authoritative parenting strategies where they explain to Johnny why they're being punished and why the behavior they engaged in was wrong. According to Godwinson and Hershey, if these three things do not happen before about ages 8 to 10, then this individual would have low self-control for the rest of their life. So they would engage in criminal and analogous behavior for the rest of their life. So not just criminal behavior, but like impulsive behavior, overeating, drug use, alcohol use, binge eating, didn't really matter. These sort of impulsive acts would be present basically throughout the life course. But Godwinson and Hershey said that eventually kids would stop offending because as they entered adulthood, they would experience burnout. Like they would have jobs still and they would become exhausted and not really have that opportunity to engage in criminal behavior because they'd be worn down. They referred to it as the inexorable effect of aging, that age for everybody basically wears them down, and I can kind of relate to this now. What's interesting about Godwinson and Hershey's perspective is that they also said that longitudinal research was entirely unnecessary and wasteful, and so I took this personally because I do longitudinal research. And here's the thing, Garvison and Hershey, in all of these assertions they made, not once did they actually present empirical data to support their perspective. They basically said that all of criminology was wrong, that low self-control causes all crime all the time, and that's the end of it. So a lot of people didn't really like Garvison and Hershey and kind of could consider them like trolls for basically saying all of these things and then just ghosting and ignoring everybody. But I think their contribution was so valuable to criminology. And it's valuable for two reasons. First, low self-control is really important to offending. Now, empirical studies have shown that among youth with low self-control, those who have low self-control are more likely to offend, but it doesn't explain all crime all the time. It accounts for about 30% of variation in criminal behavior. So Garvison and Hershey were wrong to say that it causes all crime all the time, but at least now criminologists know that low self-control matters and we need to pay attention to it. What Garvison and Hershey also did was force criminologists to take a step back and say, okay, we need to actually test whether other theoretical perspectives do matter. Does longitudinal research actually matter? Does other risk factors other than low self-control actually matter? And the answer to all these questions is yes, but at least Garvison and Hershey kind of put pressure on researchers to go out and empirically demonstrate that this was true. How do we measure low self-control? And there are a few ways, but in childhood, it's kind of hard to ask a 5-year-old, do you prefer short-term goals or long-term goals? Do you like to have things right away or later? Another way of testing for low self-control in children is what's called the marshmallow test. It looks at a child's ability to delay gratification. So we'll take a look at a little video here. It's kind of a fun video to show you what the marshmallow test actually looks like.
Okay, scoot up. Okay, so here's the deal. There's a marshmallow. You can either wait, and I'll bring you back another one, so you can have 2, or you can eat it now. So you can eat it now, or you can wait and I'll bring you back 2, okay?
Okay.
Okay, I'll be back. Okay, so I have 1 marshmallow for each of you.
Okay.
1.
Don't eat it?
And here's the deal. You can either eat it now, or you can wait till I get back and you can have 2. Okay?
Okay.
So eat it now or wait till I get back and you can have 2. And I'll be back in a little
If we wait, you'll give us 2?
Yep, if you wait, you get 2. Or you can eat it now, whichever you want. Okay? I'll be back in a little bit.
We're gonna wait. I wonder what we're gonna do. We're gonna eat it? If I want to eat something. Or we're still not gonna get to. But if you wait until she gets back, she'll give you 2. She still won't give you 2 because you ate it. Some of it. And I didn't eat a single bite of it. So don't show her, okay?
There you go. Okay, so I have this marshmallow, and you can eat it now, or if you wait a little bit, I'll bring back 2 for you to eat, okay? How you doing, Sam? Good. You've been eating. Okay, well, I'm gonna go and I haven't found a marshmallow yet, so I'm gonna look for some more, but you stay here, and if you haven't eaten that one, I'll bring you back another one, okay? I'll be right back.
Well, you're eating, not waiting for her to give back. I still ate some of it, so she's still not gonna get the joke. Let's say in your chair.
Here I come.
There,
Oh, what happened?
she ate her.
Oh, okay. Hi, Hunter, you waited! You get two! Good job! You can eat it. You can eat them now.
So we'll now move on to contemporary psychological theories of crime. And I'll begin first with operant conditioning, which is a type of learning theory. It builds upon classical conditioning that we talked about last week. The idea behind operant conditioning is that there are environmental consequences to behavior. It's not just that people learn from watching. We can learn by doing, and how people respond to our behavior can dictate whether that behavior will be repeated or exterminated. So we can think about punishment and reinforcement, and there are negative forms of punishment and reinforcement and positive forms of punishment and reinforcement. I want you to think about negative and positive, not in terms of like good and bad. Think about it more from like a mathematical standpoint. Negative is to subtract something or to take something away, whereas positive is to add something. So when we're thinking about positive reinforcement, we're talking about adding something. When we're talking about negative reinforcement, we're talking about the removal of something. So reinforcement is when we want the behavior to continue, and punishment is when we want to exterminate the behavior. So negative punishment means removing something that the individual would like. Positive punishment means applying something detrimental that the person would not like to try and stop the behavior. Positive reinforcement would be the application of something that someone likes. Negative reinforcement would be the removal of something that someone doesn't like. So for example, we want people to be encouraged to put on a seatbelt. We want to see continued behavior of wearing a seatbelt. And so if you're driving and you're not wearing a seatbelt, you'll hear that little ding, 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 ding that goes off until you put your seatbelt on. So you have this negative stimulus in the environment, but when you engage in a particular behavior, that stimuli goes away. We are removing something negative from a person's environment to ensure that the behavior occurs. Positive punishment, like classical examples, would be giving a kid an allowance for taking out the garbage or doing the dishes, any type of chore. When we think about using incarceration for youth, we could think about this maybe both in terms of positive and negative punishment. On the one hand, it's applying something that they do not like. But on the other hand, it's also taking away certain freedoms that they also value. So we can see how it can work potentially in two ways. So I've left this table up for you just to help for studying purposes, but I've put 3 terms down there at the bottom that are important to mention because they're sort of key tenets of the justice system. They are celerity, certainty, and severity. So whether a behavior is being punished or reinforced, the likelihood of those strategies being successful can be dependent on celerity, certainty, and severity. Celerity refers to the swiftness of the response. So if an individual did something wrong and is only punished like 13 years later, they're less likely to learn from that punishment. Certainty is about the probability that the behavior will be rewarded or punished. So if an individual believes that it's not likely that they're going to get punished, then they might be more likely to engage in a particular behavior. I don't like the term severity because it's kind of misleading. What severity is really referring to is proportionality. I think they just like that S alliteration sound of certainty, severity, and celerity. Severity is making sure that the reward or the punishment matches the behavior in question. To put this now into a criminological context, C. Ray Jeffrey is maybe most well known for looking at differential reinforcement. It's basically just taking those operant conditioning principles and extending them to criminal behavior. So individuals learn by doing, but there is a kind of a problem with saying that crime occurs because individuals are reinforced for that behavior. The reason why it's problematic is because it does not explain how the criminal behavior actually begins in the first place. Why did an individual initiate that criminal behavior? The initiation of the criminal behavior can't be explained by reinforcement because reinforcement is based on an individual's past experiences. So a first-time offender has no past experience. So this is where social learning theory really began to emerge to try and fill this gap. And again, remember, social learning and social learning theory are different things. Akers' social learning theory is talking about the intersection between differential association theory and differential reinforcement theory. So it calls this the DART.
It's the DORT. They call this the DORT.
Or the differential association reinforcement theory. So this helps address issues with Jeffrey's perspective by bringing together the idea that maybe an individual will initiate criminal behavior because he has seen or she has seen others rewarded for it, but maybe they will continue that behavior based on whether that behavior was rewarded or punished, or the probability of reward versus punishment, and so on. What Akers does well is also clarify some of those early learning principles about how the priority of a person's learning matters. So whether a person is learning from somebody, they see somebody engaged in a particular behavior and they respect that person, or that person reinforces or punishes their behavior, is going to be impactful in terms of whether the behavior starts or whether the behavior continues. So basically the strength of deviancy is going to continue based on those principles of severity, certainty, and celerity. Akers referred to peers, the media, and family as sort of three modalities or ways that we would learn from, or people that we would learn from, that would be particularly important for understanding the development of criminal behavior. Now we'll look at developmental criminology theories. Developmental criminology theories are a bit different from developmental psychology theories, but a lot of developmental criminology is rooted in developmental psych principles. The theories that I've talked about so far are coming from what I would refer to as the adolescence-limited criminology paradigm that I think I alluded to last week, where they tended to focus only on why some individuals in adolescence engage in criminal behavior and why others do not. So what are the differences between these two groups? So this is really important to understand. In criminology, traditionally, based on the theories we've discussed so far, the question was, why does a person not offend? It's because they had attachment and somebody else did not. They were committed and someone else was uncommitted. They were exposed to delinquent peers and they were not exposed to delinquent peers. So it's about this dividing of groups. And we make comparisons between the groups. So these youth had attachment to others. These youth did not have attachment to others. Which group was more or less likely to engage in criminal behavior? Developmental criminology emphasizes that between group comparisons are important, but equally, or maybe even more important, is the notion of within individual change or within individual stability. So what I'm interested in is not just whether John's level of involvement in pro-social activities is higher than Gary's level of involvement in pro-social activities. I want to look at John and I want to interview him on multiple occasions. When he is 8 years old, maybe I'd be interviewing the parents, but then 14 interviewing him and re-interviewing this individual over the life course to examine whether his level of involvement changes over time, and does this change have implications for whether they increase their level of offending or decrease their level of offending. So developmental criminology really emphasizes looking at a much broader set of risk factors. This is why Goverson and Hershey hated developmental criminology, because they said that low self-control causes all crime all the time. Developmental criminology says, no, there's a lot of different risk factors that matter. And guess what, Goverson and Hershey? What matters at age 4 is different from what matters at age 10, at age 15, at age 30. We have to look at the dynamic nature of the life course. When you're 4 years old, you're probably not at risk of crystal meth use. What is going to matter for antisocial behavior or aggressive behavior at age 4 is maybe going to be more tied to the family unit, because at age 4, that's more like your entire social circle. At age 13, when individuals are trying to demonstrate independence or autonomy from parents, maybe peers are going to be more important. In adulthood, maybe it's going to be your employment or your marital partner, your children, that are going to be the key risk factors. And we'll see that this is also a theme in life course criminology. But the idea here in developmental criminology is that not only are risk factors potentially dynamic, so too is criminal behavior. Criminal behavior can change over time as well. And so we need to study these transitions that we refer to as the criminal career. And here's a really important point where people can sort of hear those two terms and make an assumption that is incorrect. The criminal career approach has nothing to do with being a criminal as a career. It is not about being a professional thief or about being a gang member. The term criminal career is just referring to the longitudinal study of crime over time, starting with things like the age of onset of offending. And developmentalists think that the earlier you begin to offend, the longer your criminal career will likely last. But a criminal career could be one single crime, or it could be 53 different crimes. Criminal career research is interested in how many crimes did an individual commit at the adolescence age stage, and did they change over time. So that's developmental criminology. It places also a very big emphasis on onset, and we'll see that in a couple of the developmental theories I'll talk about now. I'll begin first with Patterson's coercion development theory. In Patterson's theory, he suggests that parenting is primarily responsible for all types of offending trajectories. But notice he's saying different types of offending trajectories. So this differs from Goverson and Hershey, who basically said that all individuals with low self-control look the same and share the exact same offending pattern. Patterson is arguing that parenting is the key to different trajectories, but how parenting influences these trajectories can vary depending on the age at which an individual experiences negative parenting practices. So on the one hand, an individual at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old might experience witnessing intimate partner violence between their parents, experiencing their own victimization or neglect. So really serious, horrific experiences with their parent that is going to be associated with more of a long-term offending trajectory. On the other hand, there's also individuals who in adolescence, so a different age stage now, they didn't experience those negative childhood risk factors or parental parenting strategies, but what they do experience in adolescence is maybe more like a neglectful, hands-off parenting strategy where they're given a lot of free rein to do what they want. They don't have many rules or boundaries or consequences for their behavior. Patterson also suggested that the child's temperament can play a role, not an excuse, but a role in the parent's poor parenting practices, where this negative temperament is referring to things like negative emotionality. So the child is throwing temper tantrums a lot, not listening to parents, doesn't care about what the parents have to say. They tend to be what we would refer to in the temperament literature as daring, so they're more risk-taking. They don't show a lot of emotion, so they might even have callous and unemotional traits. And this can play a role in the negative response by the parent. If you've ever seen the movie We Have to Talk About Kevin, you'll see this interrelationship between a mother wanting to do good, but the child's behavior wearing on her. She lacked the ability, and the father lacked the ability to respond to the negative behavior in the child in the right way. And so we see this interaction between the child's temperament actually influencing the parents' poor parenting strategy, and that poor parenting strategy reciprocating and having a negative impact on the child.
Can you say ball? 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 No? Okay. I'm gonna throw it to you. You're gonna roll it back to me. Okay? Okay. Roll it back to mommy. Yeah. Roll it back. No, roll it back to mommy. Okay. Okay. Roll it back. Okay. Just roll it back. When he was a baby, he never stopped screaming. I thought maybe it had damaged his hearing.
No, his hearing's fine.
But shouldn't he be talking by now? I read somewhere that non-verbalizing was an early sign of autism.
He has none of the telltale rocking signs. I wouldn't worry about it too much. He's a floppy little boy, isn't he? But there's nothing wrong with him.
Thank you. Okay. Roll it back to mommy. Yay! Yay! Yay. Okay. Gonna roll it back again. That was really good, Kev. Okay. Here we go. Okay? Okay?
Patterson also made the suggestion that girls would be less likely to engage in longer-term patterns of antisocial behavior because they experience differences in socialization. We might see less of this now, but especially when Patterson was writing his theory, there was the idea of gender roles, and girls were supposed to play nice and boys could be rough and tough. I'm not saying that these are okay sort of stereotypes to have, but this was the perspective at that time. So as I mentioned, the coercion development theory had these two trajectories based on the early onset and the later onset, where late onset is not like adulthood, it's later in adolescence. And the idea here being that both groups would experience negative parenting practices, but those that began offending at an early age would experience much more negative types of parenting practices. A key point to the coercion development theory trajectory model is the idea that early negative parental experiences will have cascading effects on the kid in the future. This is a notion that Moffat termed cumulative disadvantage. So it's not just that the child experiences the negative parenting strategies. Those negative parenting strategies impact the child's ability to understand how to get along with other people. And that can transcend into relationships with peers where they don't share well or they're quick to temper. They hit their friend when they are upset or when they want to communicate something. So it's the idea that parenting practices aren't just a static factor that impacts childhood and that's it. It's that the parenting practices have such a negative impact on the child that they experience changes in other life domains as well. That's why developmental criminology is so interested in change. The researcher that's probably had the greatest influence on my own research in my career would be Terry Moffat, and her development of the dual taxonomy. The dual taxonomy, I think, was a little bit more complex and a little bit more detailed than Patterson's coercion development theory. Like Patterson, Moffat acknowledged two trajectories that she termed adolescence limited and life course persistent. The AL, adolescence limited trajectory, shows signs of offending in adolescence and then a quick decline thereafter in adulthood. Keep in mind this is just a theoretical perspective. It doesn't mean that it's exactly in empirical reality. The life course persistent, or LCP trajectory, is the individual that shows signs of early antisocial behavior, like age 4, 5 years old, they're aggressive, they're throwing temper tantrums, and this continues to more serious extent throughout the entire life course. Moffat suggested that these different trajectories are associated with different causes. The AL individuals are associated with what I would refer to as social mimicry, or what Moffat referred to as social mimicry. So in childhood they have little to no antisocial behavior. In adolescence they engage in minor delinquency because they're exposed to delinquent behavior of peer groups and they want to mimic this behavior. So the AL trajectory is very much a social learning theory mechanism type of explanation. Individuals in this trajectory are trying to bridge a maturity gap. What this means is that they're now kind of physically like adults. They want to take on adult roles, but 16, 17 years old, simply lacking the skills or abilities to, say, go out and get a job, to be able to buy the car that they want, to have the autonomy that they seek. So they might engage in acting out behaviors as a proxy for being able to take on adult roles. Moffat suggested that by adulthood, these individuals would desist from crime because now the maturity gap has closed. They now are actual adults and they get to go out and get a job, be married, have a little bit more freedom, and so on. So we'll see a reduction in the crime rate here because the costs of crime are now higher. They don't want to engage in criminal behavior because maybe that will jeopardize their marriage or their job. The LCP trajectory, on the other hand, as I mentioned, antisocial conduct begins at a very early age, and it's due to two factors. It's the intersection of family adversity or negative family environment and neuropsychological deficits. Both of these factors have to be present in order for an individual to be associated with a life course persistent trajectory. Like Patterson, Moffat raises this idea of cumulative disadvantage or cumulative consequences. Because of the neuropsychological deficit and because of the family adversity, this individual may develop poor pro-social social skills. So they behave poorly in elementary school, and it might alienate them from peers, might alienate them from teachers. So maybe now they perform poorly in school, or they drop out of school, they skip school, or they look for people that are going to reward that behavior. And who is going to reward that behavior? Typically older peers who are also involved in delinquent behavior that might encourage or reinforce that individual's decision to skip school. So here's where we see that accumulation of negative consequences. Now they're dropping out of school, so they're going to be unable in adulthood to get a job, to be able to experience those thoughts of, like, if I engage in criminal behavior, it could jeopardize my adult role. They might not really be in these positive adult roles to begin with because of the accumulation of consequences. As I stressed earlier, it's a theory. Doesn't mean that it's an empirical reality. So a couple points to make here. When it comes to adolescence limited offending, it doesn't seem to stop right at adulthood, right at age 18, a switch turns off or turns on. Why would this be the case? Well, remember we talked about how in that New York Times article, the idea of like delayed adolescence or emerging adulthood, it now takes much more time to step into adult roles. The maturity gap has widened where, I'm not talking just about you, but for myself, when I was, finishing high school, it was clear that you needed to go to university to get the job that you wanted to have. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I definitely never thought I would be doing this as my career, but it was the idea that, okay, adulthood didn't start when I ended high school. I couldn't start a job right away. I wasn't getting married right away. All these things don't happen right at age 18. Maybe in 1920 they did. But for contemporary society, maybe Moffat really needs to think a little bit about emerging adulthood, and it's not adolescence limited offending, but maybe it's like adolescence through emerging adulthood, and then offending begins to stop. Next, I'll talk about life course theories, which can sometimes sound similar to developmental theories because they share some of the same principles or ideas about the emphasis on within individual change and longitudinal research. Sometimes we can use the term life course, but doesn't necessarily mean a life course theory, like Moffat referring to life course persistent offenders. I hate textbooks because they will lump developmental and life course theories into the same group. And DLC is a thing, but developmental and life course criminology are separate theoretical frameworks, and some life course criminologists don't like some developmental criminologists and vice versa. One of the things that might be helpful is thinking about developmental criminology tends to be influenced by psychology, and life course criminology tends to be influenced by sociology. So they sometimes have different perspectives on why offending starts or why offending stops. What I would say is that developmental criminology is more useful for understanding the origins and the continuity of offending. Life course theories are more so designed to explain desistance from criminal behavior. Here are some of the key pillars of life course criminology. This paradigm emphasizes historical context, so we need to understand how history and social context at the time that we're looking at a particular individual can influence that person's behavior. So for example, Sampson and Lobb are the most well-known life course criminologists, and their perspective on the development of offending and why people stop offending was based on looking at individuals involved in the war in Korea. And when these Americans returned home, they were beneficiaries of the GI Bill. The General Infantry Bill basically subsidized housing for persons that served in the military, provided education and trades training. We think nowadays about the experiences of men and women in the American military, it's much more negative. We hear about higher rates of suicide, higher rates of intimate partner violence, higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder. So this is why historical context matters. Being a person that served in the military maybe mattered in the 1930s, 1950s, but maybe now it's more of a risk factor. Another of the pillars is linked lives, the notion that how a person behaves is tied to who they're connected to. And sometimes certain people can help provide social capital that can help individuals step into a job or help an individual find the right university. Just like developmental criminology, risk factors are age graded. So what matters in terms of predicting offending at age 15 might be different from why somebody offends at age 25. Life course criminology disagrees with developmental criminology because it feels that developmental criminology is too deterministic in suggesting that life course persistent offending trajectory and the idea of cumulative disadvantage. Sampson and Lobb, in their life course criminology perspective, say that human agency allows individuals to kind of pick themselves up by their bootstraps, and through like the belief in the American dream, people can accomplish whatever that they want. And I don't really agree with this perspective so much because I think it neglects the lived experiences of certain individuals. You try to have human agency to allow you to stop offending when you have a family member who's addicted to crystal meth, and you don't have a father to look out for you at all, and you have siblings that need to eat, and you don't go to school because you have to go make money so that your siblings can eat, and you are leaving group homes because you want to go check in on your mother. I'm actually describing a real case of a kid that I've interviewed as part of the Incarcerated Serious and Violent Young Offenders study. He was dealing with no father, a mother with mental illnesses, was engaging in prostitution, was experiencing abuse by intimate partners, and was addicted to crystal meth, and she would not eat. And he would be very worried about her actual physical health. So he was living in a group home. He would AWOL from that group home to go check in on his mother, and then he would lose his group home placement, so he might be out on the street for a few days before finding a new group home. When he was under the purview of the justice system, one of the conditions of the justice system, or of his release, was that he had to reside in a particular group home. So he's living here, and he gets a note from his mother that says, like, if I didn't have you checking in on me, I would kill myself. And so he's worried that his mother is going to commit suicide. So he leaves the group home to go take care of her, and what happens? he's breached his conditions, so he gets arrested and charged with a new offense. So I don't think that life course criminology is appropriately understood that human agency, like rationality, is bounded, or at least how we exercise agency is different depending on the circumstances that we find ourselves in. For persons that are experiencing oppression, their ability to use human agency to stop offending might be limited because they're using human agency in other ways, and we have a finite level of agency. So that's something to keep in mind when thinking about human agency. I do believe it's important, but I don't believe it's something that we all have an equal amount of, or that we're all able to exercise in the same way. One of the key terms that Sampson and Lobb introduced to criminology was the idea of turning point. So focusing on why adolescents involved in criminal behavior would desist from crime in adulthood. And they specified 5 key turning points: military involvement, housing, marriage, children, and employment. So all of these are what are referred to as informal social controls. I mentioned like maybe military involvement is not as applicable today, and for these other ones like marriage, children, and employment, maybe they're just happening a little bit later in the life course for most individuals. An important point about these turning points is that Moffat would say, whoa, whoa, whoa. For an individual who's associated with life course persistent offending, they are going to be unable to experience positive turning points. So maybe the life course persistent offender will experience a marriage, but they'll be married to an antisocial partner who is going to maybe promote their continued involvement in criminal behavior. Or more realistically, what Moffat would say is that for the individual who has a neuropsychological deficit, so let's say it's fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and it came from a really abusive family environment. And these two things that lead to cumulative disadvantage, like poor school performance, are going to make it really difficult for this person to become employed. So we need to think about not just like doing this person for a life of crime, but thinking, we need to do things that are going to help this individual desist from criminal behavior. Sampson and Lobb, on the other hand, use the term desistance by default and basically say that all individuals will eventually stop offending. And I take issue with this perspective because there might be people that are really struggling and really in need of intervention and services, and if we tell service providers, or we tell, as researchers, if we tell the government, don't worry about service provisions, these people will desist by default, we could see some really harmful consequences to these people and their families. In our study of 1,719 kids who we've included in the incarcerated serious and violent young offender study, and about 7% of them are dead. They're not yet 4 years old, and they've experienced mortality because of things like drug use overdose due to the fentanyl crisis. So if we keep saying things like, oh, they'll desist by default, then we're ignoring really severe social problems, real severe disadvantage that we need to recognize in order to prevent not just criminal behavior, but negative social outcomes like drug overdoses. I'm just going to show this slide here of integrated theories that you might find interesting for thinking about how you would approach that essay topic that you have for the term paper about applying theory. So there are 3 integrated theories discussed in your textbook. And what I would say is that Thornberry's interactional theory is maybe the most well-known, where he's integrating themes from different criminological theories. For the final exam, I'm not going to ask you specific questions about specific integrated theories because it's kind of hard to keep track of all of them. I just want you to understand that the idea is taking principles from different theories and mashing them together. Garvison and Hershey hate this idea. Others who think that crime is maybe a bit more complex would say, no, this is a good idea. So ultimately, it comes down to that principle that we talked about last week of parsimony. Historically, criminology has done a very poor job of thinking about the development of offending for girls and women. In the early days, the thinking about female involvement in criminal behavior was so sexist that it would have been better to have completely ignored the offending by women than to actually develop theories for it. So for example, Cesare Lombroso had, as I mentioned, those really sort of like sexist theories about Sicilian women, We saw, again, I'm not going to repeat them because they're not really useful, but my point is that there was a time where criminologists were thinking about female offending from a very sexist perspective. And then, in maybe also a sexist perspective, criminologists just forgot about female offending altogether. And it wasn't until like around the 1960s with the women's liberation movement that feminist criminological research really began to emerge. So it was more like sociological research emerged and sociological theories emerged, and then criminology looked at these theories and adapted them to understand involvement in criminal behavior. So some theories look at why women engage in less crime. One of the perspectives, which I still think is kind of sexist, is the chivalry theory, the idea that women are treated more leniently than men in various stages of the justice system. And I actually think this is complete bullshit, because researchers actually found that judges can be paternalistic, which is where they believe in, like, if a young girl, and we'll talk about this in a couple of weeks, 7, 8 years old, or let's say a young girl who's 12 years old is engaging in criminal behavior, it's more shocking to a judge than a boy that's 12 years old that's engaging in the same criminal behavior, because girls are not supposed to do those things, and it's okay for boys to be like this. So the girl might actually be punished more punitively. Or when I mentioned those paternalistic attitudes, it's the idea that the young girl might be living in the downtown east side and might be engaging in severe drug use, might be engaging in sex trade work. And these are all really awful things, and we want to be able to support this individual so that she no longer has to do those things. We shouldn't incarcerate them because of it. This is another way of restricting a person's freedom and making them angry at the justice system and angry at social systems more generally. The idea is to find ways outside of the formal justice system, so from a public health response, to provide services for this individual should they wish to use them. Other theoretical perspectives, especially stemming from sociology, have focused on why women do involve themselves in crime. They've focused on things like patriarchal structures where there's, glass ceilings or inopportunities in the workforce that create needs to engage in criminal behavior as a way to help, for example, support family members. The integrated liberation and economic marginalization theory had this same idea that I just mentioned, but felt that as women become more equal in the workforce, so as we see greater equality, we would also see greater levels of equality in crime. So as women are more outside of the home, they'll have more opportunities to engage in criminal behavior. This didn't actually happen. We saw the change in, for example, women's employment rates, but we didn't see the crime rate go up. And I don't know if feminist researchers were thinking this perspective through, because it really could have actually hurt the women's liberation movement if you're arguing that women were going to commit more crime if they were going to be more able to have equality in the workforce. Other theoretical perspectives from more of a psychological viewpoint have looked at female-specific pathways into criminal behavior. The risk factors for offending differ for girls compared to boys. So girls might respond differently to certain life experiences. And one of these is the experience of physical and/or sexual abuse. Typically in this class, I also talk a little bit about contemporary biological theories. Based on feedback I got from last semester, long lectures can be fairly overwhelming for students, so I'm not going to talk about contemporary biological theories here. I will post a link to another lecture that does talk about these theoretical perspectives if students are interested in learning more. So that's it for week 4. Have a great week, everybody. I'll be doing that special lecture, special topic lecture for week 5, so make sure you pay attention to Canvas because there'll be a reading posted that you should do in preparation for the week 5 lecture. Take care and have a great rest of your week. So molecular genetics allows us to look at neurotransmitters that are managed by the nervous system and hormones that are managed by the endocrine system. And basically what's also very important to understand that genes are not static nor fixed. In fact, they can even be influenced by the environment. So just because someone might have like neurotransmitter like serotonin that's elevated and places them at risk for offending, doesn't mean that serotonin is going to remain high over the entire life course. So some of the background of molecular genetics, and you can see the title slides in red, so it's not going to be on the exam. Typically have 46 chromosomes that are divided into 23 different pairs, and each chromosome contains DNA strands that are comprised of thousands of genes. And some genes come in different forms, and these are called polymorphisms. And basically, they can help explain this. These different forms help explain why there's variation among people in behavior and physical features and so on. Alternative forms of the same gene are called alleles, and a particular human trait is typically governed by multiple genes and can be referred to as polygenic. So there are two main perspectives on how genetics and molecular genetics particularly might explain why some individuals do or do not become involved in crime. So the diathesis stress model basically looks at how individuals might have a particular propensity or genetic vulnerability to a particular disorder, particular form of psychopathology, but if they can avoid the environmental trigger, then the disorder will not actually manifest. So it says that people will be born with a propensity, but if they can avoid negative aspects in the environment, then they can avoid this negative sort of outcome. The differential susceptibility model is a little bit more optimistic. So it says that individuals are born with this underlying propensity, but depending on the environment, this propensity can either be very good or negative. So if the individual has this underlying propensity and is exposed to a very positive environment, this can actually help them become very successful in, whether they're an artist, a musician, athlete, so on. Whereas, just like the diathesis stress model, they also acknowledge that if something negative happens, then we could see the adverse outcome also manifesting. So when we're talking about neurotransmitters, we're referring to the body's chemical messenger, basically sending signals or messages between neurons. And neurotransmitters can become unbalanced both through genetics or through environmental susceptibility. So the key to understanding neurotransmitters is it's actually, the problem is balance. It's not necessarily like you having too much is a good thing, but too little is a bad thing, or vice versa. There's a particular right amount of a specific neurotransmitter that can help individuals function correctly. So for the purposes of this class, we're going to focus on three main neurotransmitters: serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. So serotonin is all about allowing us to inhibit our behavior and regulate our moods. So adequate levels of serotonin allow us to be balanced, allow us to respond calmly in adverse situations, whereas malfunctioning serotonin, so imbalanced serotonin, can lead to higher levels of aggression. Dopamine is something that gives us feelings of pleasure. So it can be negative if we have too much dopamine, and we might have feelings of euphoria. This is something that individuals with bipolar disorder can sometimes experience. And when dopamine is really too high, the individual might be more likely to take risks. Dopamine is too low, this can be associated with things like depression, and this can also lead to involvement in negative behavior, especially when depression creates frustration or anxiety and can lead to aggression as well. Norepinephrine is something that helps us deal with short-term stress. Like if we're driving and someone cuts us off, or if we're in a rush to get to work, it can help us moderate those feelings of stress, or at least help us bring us back down to a normal baseline relatively quickly. Whereas people with imbalanced levels of norepinephrine, they might experience a relatively minor stressful event, but they're never able to really return to baseline. And again, this is something that's also correlated with aggression. Monoamine oxidase A, or MAOA, as it's more commonly referred to, is not a neurotransmitter, it's an enzyme. Sometimes it's been referred to as the warrior gene because initial research thought that persons with low levels of MAOA would be more aggressive. This was something that eventually kind of was shown to be false. The MAOA enzyme is responsible for breaking down neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. And very, very importantly, not all individuals with malfunctioning MAOA are criminally or overly aggressive. Really, what we tend to see is that there's again, that gene times environment interaction. When there's imbalances in MAOA, what we'll see is that specifically low levels of MAOA that are unable to correctly process serotonin and other neurotransmitters. This will lead to criminal behavior if the individual has also experienced childhood maltreatment. And again, very importantly, just because somebody has low levels of functioning of MAOA and has experienced childhood maltreatment doesn't mean that they're going to go on to engage in criminal behavior. It just places them at risk. So we want to pay attention to these adverse childhood experiences that might amplify the risk of offending when also in the presence of low activity of MAOA. These different neurotransmitters and enzymes are modulated by the central nervous system. On the other hand, hormones in crime are dealt with by the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is responsible for the production and distribution of these different hormones, and there's a variety of different types of hormones that are important to the body, but the one that's maybe most relevant to understanding criminal behavior is testosterone. So this is produced by different glands, and there are about 7 or 8 different glands in our body. The ones that we maybe most commonly hear about are the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands. Imbalances in hormones can lead to mood swings that can obviously also include aggression. So we can be worried again about these different levels of hormones. Very, very importantly, hormones change a lot, not just over the long versus short term. So yes, it's true that we see that, especially among males, by the time they reach 35 years old, their levels of testosterone tend to be on the decline. But even for any individual who's listening to this lecture right now, your level of testosterone is going to change just literally throughout the day. When you wake up in the morning, your levels of testosterone tend to be higher. This is why some high-level athletes prefer to work out in the morning, because it might give them that extra advantage. Probably not going to be advantageous for your average person, but for those competing at the highest level, it's thought to maybe be useful. So why does this matter for crime? Well, think about if you're working in a custody center and you've got 15 male offenders living on your unit, and you think, well, crime's normally committed at night, so maybe we're not worried about the morning. But think about the morning where people are trying to get in the shower, get breakfast, and this is a time where their hormone levels or their testosterone levels might be most likely to be imbalanced. So this is actually when assaults against other inmates or against staff members might actually be at an increased risk of happening. So from a correctional services standpoint, we might want to have more staff available or make sure there's more organization in terms of when people are allowed into the washroom or having breakfast. We can't talk about genetic research without talking about the brain. So think about the brain in crime. There are a couple of ways to go about studying how it might be related to criminal behavior. One is through neuroimaging research, and the other is through neuropsychology. So neuroimaging research looks directly at the structure and the functioning of the brain. So recall from last week we talked about fMRI scans, and this will look at the structural characteristics of the brain, and then positron emission topography scans or PET scans that can look at how the brain actually functions. And one of the ways that people began to really take an interest in the brain, specifically the frontal lobe, was through the case study of Phineas Gage. So this is where he was working, think like at a mine, and a tampering rod went through his skull and through his brain, and it damaged his frontal lobe. And he experienced a really fundamental shift in his personality, was more aggressive, was more impulsive. And so people really began to believe that there's something about specific areas of the brain that are responsible for specific functions. Another thing that we can look at is impairments to the limbic system, which is going to have an influence on emotional regulation, but also things like callous and unemotional traits. And both of these things are going to be implicated in antisocial behavior. Very importantly, there's no one brain structure that's ultimately responsible for criminal behavior. There can be multiple factors, as well as multiple parts of the brain responsible for the same thing. The other way of looking at the brain is through neuropsychology, and this is really more like pencil and paper tests. So it can even something as simple as an IQ test would be an example of looking at the functioning of the brain. But again, it's not looking at the brain directly, it's indirectly by seeing how the individual responds to certain questions, and that can give an indication of how the brain is functioning. Let's look at this photo here of the brain, and we have several different structures. So we have in blue the frontal lobe, in yellow the parietal lobe, in pink the occipital lobe, green is the temporal lobe, and white is the brain stem and cerebellum. So when we're looking at the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe is responsible for vision. So when you're thinking about, if you ever heard the phrase like eyes in the back of your head, the occipital lobe is the part of the brain that's in the back of the brain. So it's where your eyes literally actually are in order to function. When it comes to crime, we're really especially interested in the frontal lobe because it's responsible for things like planning, action, and the ability to inhibit our desires. It's also responsible for higher order thinking and personality. So you're not going to have to memorize all of this for the exam, but the point of telling you this is to illustrate that it's one spot of the brain, but it's not just responsible for one thing. It's responsible for a whole host of different things. The temporal lobe that you'll see in green is also very important for understanding criminal behavior, and it's related to our understanding of things like emotional memory and the processing of emotions. Another key part of the brain is the limbic system, and we'll look specifically at the amygdala and the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, and the thalamus. So the amygdala is comprised of two sort of almond-shaped looking structures responsible for processing emotional memory. And so this can kind of give us our emotional fight versus flight sensors. So Adrian Raine is a criminologist, but he has his PhD training in neuropsychology and neuroimaging. So in his book, The Anatomy of Violence, he looked at the differences in functioning of the brain across individuals involved in crime and not involved in crime, as well as individuals with features of psychopathy and people who scored low on a measure of features of psychopathy. So what you see here are images of two brains of two different persons. And I guess this maybe will be flipped around for you, but the left side maybe for you, the one with the brain with a greater amount of color, this is basically glucose metabolism, and it lights up when the individual's brain is working correctly, when all areas of the brain are firing. If you look at the other image, you can see that there's really not a lot of color there, and this is because of low levels of glucose metabolism. And this is primarily in the areas of the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. So what it's suggesting is that persons with features of psychopathy might be lacking in these more key areas. The next slide here, we've got a similar image, but instead of looking at the top, looking at it from the side, you can see in the back again where we will find the temporal lobe, we'll see differences between individuals. This time somebody who's not committed a homicide offense. I believe this actually might have been Adrian Raine's own brain that he showed, and then another person who has actually committed a homicide offense. So we can see some fairly key distinctions here. And again, this is using positron emission topography. In terms of other areas of biological research, one that's very important is epigenetics. Epigenetics is the study of basically the environmental impact on genes, and it tells us when genes need to turn on or turn off. So there's chemical markers that attach to genes and affect how a particular gene is expressed. So it's not just that it's going to be turn on, it can also be slowing down or speeding up. So it can impact giving the body too much or too little of something. Make sure you're not eating while I talk about this, but in Florida they have a very large homeless population. One reason is the weather, so people can survive year long. And the other is that they also have sex offender registries that require individuals to basically not be allowed to live in certain areas. So individuals involved in sexual offenses that were homeless tended to congregate underneath these different bridges in Florida. And researchers studied these individuals and compared them to basically a general population. And what they found was that the feet of individuals that committed sexual offenses was much, much thicker. Very importantly, it's not saying that thick feet is a risk factor for sexual offending, but basically what happened was that these individuals were outside a lot and very often didn't even have shoes. So their feet were touching the earth a lot, and this actually told their brain to turn on this genetic marker that we all have to have thicker feet, because back when we were in the forest, so pillaging for food, we need to have thick feet. We didn't have shoes. So we can see here how something that, maybe our bodies had gotten rid of by 300 years ago has now returned in this particular circumstance because of the shift in environment. So when we're thinking about epigenetics, there's two really important terms that you need to know. One is prenatal complications and the other is perinatal complications. So this refers to a woman who is pregnant, and prenatal conditions or adverse conditions refer to instances of adverse environmental experiences that can occur to the fetus while the woman is pregnant. So drinking while pregnant, smoking while pregnant, not having proper nutrition. These are all prenatal risk factors that can impact the individual in utero. Perinatal risk factors, on the other hand, are factors that occur during the actual pregnancy. So things like prolonged pregnancy, the umbilical cord wrapping around a child's neck, a breached baby, these are all risk factors for later neuropsychological deficits. Again, very important to understand that it doesn't mean that because a baby has been breached, they're definitely going to experience these neuropsychological deficits and definitely going to become involved in crime, but they are risk factors that can increase the likelihood that these negative outcomes are going to occur. So for all those people whose partner might be pregnant, if they're saying at 3 a.m., I need ice cream, you go out, you get them ice cream, keep them happy, because the low stress is going to lead to the low stress of the baby. The baby will be born with a healthy temperament, and that will mean that they won't be causing you problems for the next, 30, 40, 50 years of your life. So that one trip to 7-Eleven can save you a lot of grief in the future. With respect to our body's nervous system, we can divide the nervous system further into the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. So recall, you've seen that prefix before, soma, with Sheldon's somatotype. The somatic nervous system is really dealing with our body's functioning and movement. So from a chronological perspective, we're not as interested in the somatic nervous system as we are the autonomic nervous system, where we're going to make a distinction between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system prepares our body for the flight versus flight activation. So it can tell us, it'll send signals to the heart that everything is not okay, our heart rate will increase, and we'll engage in fight or flight. It's about increasing or elevating the heart rate to let us know that maybe we're in danger. The parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for reducing our heart rate when the fear or the threat subsides. So it's responsible for telling us that everything is okay. Both need to be in balance. So the sympathetic nervous system will let us know when we should be concerned about something. An underreactive sympathetic nervous system is maybe a feature of individuals with features of psychopathy, because what's going to happen is they won't see the danger in things. They will not think that this is a risky situation, and so they'll seek out that different opportunity. Our parasympathetic system is imbalanced. It never really gets us back to baseline. So we might have a sympathetic nervous system that's functioning correctly and tells us that we should be worried. But when we leave that negative or scary situation, if our parasympathetic system isn't functioning properly, we won't calm down. So we won't be able to relax. We might be high alert, and that can lead to things like anxiety and aggressiveness. An under-responsive autonomic nervous system is essentially what we want to think of as the problem for crime. We're not experiencing enough fear to inhibit behavior, or when punishment happens, it does not actually trigger a response to create avoidance learning. We experience the punishment, but we don't really care, so we're not going to try and avoid it in the future. Skin conductance, so another word for just sweating, is another example of low autonomic functioning. So low skin conductance and a low heart rate suggest their poor fear conditioning. and these can be associated with low levels of empathy as well. Temperament is a person's building blocks towards personality. So temperament can be comprised of two symptoms, our internal functioning and our external functioning. Internal functioning is referring to thought processes. So what we think about, how we interpret, sort of our internal voice of how we're interpreting different scenarios. It speaks to like our ability to be adaptable and comfortable in new environments. So children with poor internal functioning, if they're taken out of their home and placed in daycare or placed in school, they're in this new situation. If their internal functioning is not in order, they might become highly reactive. External functioning is about what you can visibly see in the person, so excessive motor activity and hyperactivity. We think that temperament is almost like 100% driven by genes because we can begin to observe it at a very, very early age of development. What's also important to understand, though, is the environment and temperament can intersect. So, for example, a child with a negative temperament, which means they can be like more daring, more oppositional, this can really impact the parents, basically their level of energy to use the proper parenting style to respond to this youth's misbehavior. So the parent, in response to the negative temperament of their child, might change from a good, say, authoritative parenting style to an authoritarian or neglectful parenting style because of the negative experience that they've had with this child, which can in turn further amplify the risk of offending for this individual with a negative temperament. Not all of us might think of it this way, but diet is also very important to hormone regulation, which we typically think is governed by genetics. What we eat can impact brain functioning and can impact hormonal regulation. One of the things that we can eat that can be useful for reducing risk of involvement in crime is fish oil, or specifically omega-3s. A great example of this is in Norway, they did a randomized controlled trial, which is very rare in criminology. A randomized controlled trial means that we are able to take one group as the control group, and they receive no treatment, and one group randomly assigned to the treatment group. So these individuals do receive the treatment. The reason why we don't often see this in criminology is because sometimes it can be unethical, because it involves us withholding treatment from one group, and maybe that would increase their risk of crime. So they did this randomized controlled trial with omega-3 oil. And what they found was that the individuals in custody that were given omega-3 oils were at a very strongly reduced risk of being involved in violent behavior while in custody compared to the group that was not using omega-3 fish oils. They were just given their diet as per usual. So we've talked a lot about genetics and the brain in today's class. It's also very important to be careful with what you think you know and what we think that we've learned. So that's it for today. Hopefully everyone's been having a good week.